my talk is about 3D, basically making 3D X-rays, which is not a new science. It's actually quite an old technique, but it's been forgotten. Let me tell you the story of how I got interested in this. About 3 years ago, we took our son to the orthodontist because his teeth weren't coming in quite right. And the orthodontist did a panoramic X-ray, which you see up there on the left. And circled is what he called a supernumerary tooth, an extra tooth. And we also had that backed up. We went to the son's dentist, who took a regular X-ray. You see that on the right. And the arrow points to the supernumerary tooth. Anyway, we were told this had to be surgically removed, and for the surgeon to be able to do this work, he would have to know the three-dimensional relationship of this tooth with respect to everything else up there, all the other teeth. And that would require a cone beam CAT scan, cone beam CT. My first thought there was, no, it wouldn't. Actually, it would just require a second X-ray. But how would I have known that? Why did I think that? Well, imagine, if you will, a light panel behind a, arguably, let's say, translucent subject, and the light rays from that panel going to your eyes. This is how you would see a translucent subject. Now, if you reverse the situation and you take the beams and make them come from where the eyes were and going through the subject to a detector, those rays are exactly the same path. So this is how intuitively I knew that if I had two X-ray sources, or let's say if I translated a single X-ray source to make two exposures, I could get a three-dimensional image. Now, I couldn't go to my boy's dentist because I didn't know my boy's dentist very well, but I went to my own dentist, who I've known for 30 years, and I plied him with some drawings and explanations and captured his interest in the idea of making a 3D X-ray of this supernumerary tooth. And so I basically explained to him, in his office I know they use a handheld X-ray source, which is, of course, very easily translated, just like so. So we would make a left-hand exposure, translate it, and make a right-hand exposure, and then get a 3D X-ray of the supernumerary tooth. And here you see that. Oh yes, I'm sorry. Please put your polarized glasses on, and you may keep them on because I'm going to have several more slides with 3D images on them. Also, in the upper left-hand corner of all my slides for the next 10 minutes, you'll see a QR code which links to a URL on my website. The QRL links to a URL on my website with all these images in several different formats. So you don't need to photographically memorize these. You can go to my website using that QR code. And you could use Stereoscope, or you could use your 3D TV, or I also have them up there in anaglyph if you want to study them further. So here you see the supernumerary tooth, and you see it in relationship to the other tooth. The primary teeth that were getting very gap-toothed and very cute, and his permanent teeth above that were failing to come in at the right age. Anyway, the project then kind of went dormant because all I had was one 3D picture of teeth, and there's not much you can do with that. Fast forward 3 years, or 2.5 years, to March of last year. And I was presented with a new opportunity to do 3D X-rays because I had a bicycle crash and I fractured several bones in my left shoulder. Now, I was in no position in the emergency room to cajole anybody into making 3D X-rays. I was in a lot of pain. But about a week after I came out of the hospital, I went to my orthopedist, and this would have been part of my regular sort of convalescence. I wanted to get a second opinion from him about the condition of my ribs. And so I explained to him how to do the 3D X-rays. And now we did it exactly the same way, except for it's a bigger X-ray source, which you translate a little bit more. So we translated the source 2 inches, and the source was about 40 inches from the detector, which makes for a roughly 5-degree convergence. And then we shot an X-ray. Now you'll notice, if you have good stereo vision, that this is a flat X-ray right here. This is just one of the exposures. And as soon as you add the second exposure, you get 3D, and you start seeing much more clearly the overlapping bones and the structures that are involved. In fact, of particular interest here is if you go back to the flat one, you can just barely make out my shoulder blade behind the ribs, but you can't really see much else. And in this 3D version, at least I can make out that I have a fracture in my shoulder blade as well. In the next slide here, I've just marked some of these fractures. The numbers pertain to the number of the rib, so there's a number 2 rib, a number 3 rib, and so forth. You can see the number 3 rib has 2 fractures, and that's something I would have missed in the flat X-ray, but I have no training. And then there's more fractures. Anyway, my point here is that here's some 3D imaging that's been done, but there's no CT scan involved. At the same time, at the same visit, I said to my orthopedist, hey, I've got some pain in my hand. Let's take an X-ray of my hand as well. We justified it with some pain. And this is the flat version. Now I want you to look at the wrist bones in particular. There's no fracture in the wrist bones, but the wrist bones are the most interesting because had there been a fracture in there, it would have been very difficult, probably impossible to really locate it in space. But in 3D, you can clearly see the position of each of the bones. They're clearly disambiguated. And if there had been a fracture in one of those bones, maybe a surgeon would have said that's good enough, and they would not have required a CT CAT scan. Fast forward another month or two, and I was ready to go into physical therapy. And at physical therapy, this was a different location. They said to me, well, we'll do your physical therapy, but we require an X-ray first. Now, ordinarily, I would have said, no way, I don't want any more X-rays. They're expensive and there's a lot of radiation. But of course, I was on a mission now. So I finally convinced them, who I didn't know them in advance, and it took quite a bit of convincing. But they agreed to make this X-ray according to my specifications. But we discovered something unhappy, which is that the X-ray source in this office could not be moved. It could be moved, but it could only be moved in increments of 6 or 8 inches or some very large distance, which would have been quite unsuitable for making a 3D X-ray. So I had to think on my feet, and you'll see here I'm thinking on my feet by moving sideways on my feet. This is a technique for actually making 3D photographs with a single lens camera. You just shift your weight on your feet. And this is how I made this 3D X-ray that you see on the right. It's actually one of the better ones, and I was surprised. I had to be very careful about not moving anything else on my body, just shifting my weight on my feet, and it worked out okay. Going back just about a month, in December, I had a toothache, and I had to go to my dentist. Now, my dentist already knew about my 3D stereoscopic disease, so he was not at all surprised when I said, hey, let's shoot 2 X-rays. But on that day, he didn't have the handheld emitter. He was going to use the one that's mounted on the wall, a much older machine. And this was a machine that was going to be very difficult to move precisely, 1 centimeter or half a centimeter or something like that. So I suggested to him, let's keep the machine stationary, and I will simply rotate my head between the 2 exposures. So here's first exposure, and then I would have rotated my head like this, left and right, and made the second exposure, and that's what made this 3D picture of a molar. Here's the flat version, and here's the 3D version. This one didn't turn out quite so well, but I think that's because, well, it was my first try. People should give me a break. So another obstacle now to this technique, so far there's been no obstacles other than maybe learning how to do it. There's no technological obstacles. There's a little bit of an obstacle in 3D screens these days, but luckily I saw Weissman's presentation just a little while ago, where he's describing a good way to do 3D screens. And I've heard from other people they are still available. But even if an office did not want to make the modest investment in a 3D screen, you can still view these 3D images, of course, using an anaglyph process, or even a stereo pair process, using a lorgnette, or even using free viewing. This might be useful in remote locations where they don't have access to 3D screens. It shouldn't be a barrier, fundamentally. One other important thing is that if you shoot 3D images this way, alignment is going to be an issue. But fortunately, there's also software already available from two different people that automatically aligns stereo pairs. And I'm sure there's actually more people doing this. And it shouldn't be too hard once this sort of thing catches on to integrate this kind of software. And it should be integrated into the flow of imagery from the X-ray machine to the monitor, of course. Now you might ask, well, what's the point of 3D X-rays when we are in an age of computed tomography? Because that makes lovely images. Well, I want to point out a few advantages now that we have with 3D stereoscopic radiography. I call it 3D SR. Nobody's used that term yet. I looked it up on Google. 3D SR, first of all, uses far less ionizing radiation. When I went into the ER, they did a CT scan of my shoulder, and that CT scan used about 200 times as much radiation as a pair of X-rays would have used. That's a big difference, and it's especially important in a pediatric setting. I'm old enough where it probably doesn't matter. I'm going to die pretty soon anyway. The next thing that I learned in researching this recently is that regular radiographs have better spatial resolution. And in fact, they have better resolution over a comparable field of view by a factor of 5. So you can see finer details, hairline fractures, and so on. You would be able to see them more quickly and more easily in a 3D SR as compared to a CT scan. 3D SR is going to be much faster than a CT scan. In my case, when I went into the ER, there was a good 15-20 minutes that they took to get me into the CT room where the big CT machine is, and then they put me down on the CT machine bed, which was very painful. And then they got the scan done. And all of that was a lot of time, and then there's more time in the data processing and in the analysis later on. I noticed also that all the clinicians looked at my CT scan by looking through all these slices, hundreds of slices, which were completely incomprehensible to me. And I think actually there's a big advantage there with 3D SR, where you can have one quick look and using your stereoscopic vision and get a very quick high-resolution overview, which you can't really do that with a CT scan, or at least it seems nobody's trained to do that. Because 3D SR relies really just on X-ray, well-established X-ray machine technology, it would be available in remote or constrained settings. In fact, I know in the military setting they have portable X-ray machines that they bring right up to the front to deal with casualties. This is also something that would be impossible with a CT machine. And finally, the cost of CT is much higher than regular X-ray, regular radiography, direct radiography. CT machines involve a very high capital investment and also much higher costs in terms of maintenance. You need specialized technicians to maintain the machines. You need costly specialized parts. The direct radiography is far more widely known and far more widely used and much less costly. And this would be of some significance, I think, in the lower and middle income countries where you have one CT machine per million inhabitants, whereas in the West we have 40 CT machines per million inhabitants. Probably those numbers have gone up a bit since I got this data. This data is a couple years old, but I'm sure the ratio is not any better. So I think if it were possible to adopt 3D SR in lower middle income countries, the standard of care, the quality of care would be much improved for very many people. So to summarize, 3D SR gives the following advantages: reduced radiation dose, better spatial resolution, faster imaging, processing and analysis of the images, because the analysis is perfectly natural. It uses your stereo vision of the clinician. This can also be very useful in a triage setting where you might have a large number of casualties that you need to assess rapidly. And similarly, availability in remote or constrained settings is possible with 3D SR and not possible with CT, or not as possible. And it's reduced cost. So CT scanning is costly compared to 3D SR, where you have relative affordability and much wider availability. My purpose in this talk here is I need to find some people, clinicians, maybe in some lower or middle income country or anywhere where this technique may find usefulness. I'm hoping to find such a person. So if anybody knows any leads or can give me any leads or can bring this work to the attention of any appropriate people, I would be much obliged. Thank you. Any questions?